You know, when most folks think about World War II's final days, they picture Allied forces marching through defeated German cities, Nazi officials burning documents, or Hitler's bunker beneath Berlin. But here's the thing. Scattered across the Reich were hundreds of underground facilities that never made it into the history books. We're talking about reinforced concrete bunkers buried so deep that even today, decades later, some remain completely untouched. The Wehrmacht had constructed over 15,000 fortified positions along the Atlantic Wall alone, and that's just what we know about. Intelligence reports from 1945 suggest there were classified installations, research facilities, command centers, storage depots that simply vanished from official records when the Third Reich crumbled. What happened inside those forgotten chambers? Well, that's where our story begins, and trust me, it's gonna make you question everything you thought you knew about the war's end. Now, historians will tell you that by March 1945, German forces were in full retreat, desperately trying to regroup as Allied armies closed in from all sides. Official casualty reports show the Wehrmacht losing nearly 300,000 men per month during those final months. Soldiers either killed, wounded, or simply disappearing into the chaos of a collapsing empire. But here's what those same historians won't mention. There were entire units, whole companies of battle-hardened SS troops that went missing without explanation. No bodies recovered, no surrender documents, no trace whatsoever. The Red Army found empty bases with meals still warm on tables, personal belongings left behind, weapons abandoned in perfect working order. It was as if these soldiers had simply vanished. But some battles, my friends, don't end when the guns fall silent, and some horrors outlast the wars that created them. Enter Oberfeldwebel Klaus Weber, a grizzled Wehrmacht veteran who'd survived 3 years on the Eastern Front before being reassigned to what the brass called special research duties. Weber wasn't your typical soldier. Hell, he'd started the war as a university student studying archaeology before the fatherland came calling. Now, at 26, he commanded a small reconnaissance unit attached to Untold SS, that mysterious organization Heinrich Himmler had created to explore Germany's mystical heritage. Weber's unit, designated as Forschungsgruppe Schwarze Sonne, Black Sun Research Group, was composed of 12 men handpicked not just for their combat experience, but for their ability to keep their mouths shut about things that didn't make sense. They'd been stationed for 3 weeks at a facility that officially didn't exist, a concrete labyrinth buried beneath the Harz Mountains, designated only as Anlage 7 in coded communications. The local civilians had been evacuated months ago, leaving behind ghost villages and an atmosphere thick with unspoken dread. The bunker itself was a marvel of German engineering gone wrong, and Weber could feel it in his bones every damn day. Built into a natural cave system that the SS had modified with explosives and slave labor, the facility stretched 5 levels down into the mountain's heart. The main entrance was camouflaged behind what looked like a bombed-out farmhouse. But once you descended past the first checkpoint, reality seemed to shift. Corridors ran in geometric patterns that made no tactical sense. Pentagrams, hexagrams, and symbols Weber couldn't identify, carved directly into the reinforced concrete walls. The air tasted metallic, like blood and electricity, and the lights flickered constantly despite the diesel generators running perfectly. Temperature readings showed 45 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the facility, yet Weber's men complained about feeling feverish. Strangest of all were the chambers they weren't supposed to enter, sealed doors marked with SS Oberfuhrer Kammler's personal seal, from behind which came sounds that definitely weren't machinery. But orders were orders, and Weber had learned long ago not to question what the Ahnenerbe considered research. Weber's team was small but reliable, the kind of soldiers who'd follow orders even when those orders made their skin crawl. There was Unterscharführer Hans Müller, a former Berlin police detective whose sharp eyes missed nothing, and whose dry humor kept morale from completely tanking. Feldwebel Erich Zimmermann served as their communications specialist, though the radio equipment down here barely functioned, picking up strange frequencies that broadcast in languages none of them recognized. Finally, there was Gefreiter Otto Braun, barely 19 but already hardened by 2 years of brutal combat, who'd volunteered for this assignment to escape court-martial for questioning orders during a particularly ugly pacification operation in occupied Poland. These weren't glory-seeking SS fanatics. They were regular Wehrmacht soldiers trying to survive a war that seemed to grow more insane by the day. Little did they know that their greatest test wouldn't come from Allied bombers or Soviet tanks, but from something far older and infinitely more hungry. Something their own people had been foolish enough to wake up in the darkness beneath the mountains. It started on their 18th night in Anlage 7, during what should have been a routine security sweep of Level 3. Weber was leading his usual midnight patrol when they heard it, a sound that definitely wasn't supposed to exist down there. Picture this. You're walking through a concrete corridor lit by stuttering fluorescent bulbs, your boots echoing off bare walls, when suddenly there's this scratching. Not the scurrying of rats or the settling of old concrete, but deliberate, rhythmic scratching, like fingernails or claws being dragged across metal. The sound seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, following them as they moved, stopping when they stopped, resuming when they continued. Muller was the first to voice what they were all thinking. Sounds like someone's trying to get out. But Weber knew the building plans by heart. There were no spaces between those walls, nothing but solid reinforced concrete packed with steel mesh. Yet the scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent, until it felt like the walls themselves were alive and hungry. When they finally reached the end of the corridor, the sound simply stopped. Dead silence. Even their own breathing seemed too loud in the sudden vacuum of noise. The smell hit them next. And Christ, it was unlike anything Weber had experienced even after 3 years of battlefields littered with decomposing corpses. This wasn't the clean stench of recent death or even the sickly sweet rot of bodies left too long in summer heat. No, this was something older, deeper, like meat that had been left to putrefy in a sealed tomb for centuries. The odor seemed to seep from the ventilation grates thick enough to taste, coating their tongues with the flavor of decay and something else, something metallic and bitter that made their stomachs churn. Zimmermann actually gagged, pressing his sleeve against his nose, muttering prayers in rapid-fire German. But here's the really disturbing part. According to the facility's environmental controls, air quality readings showed nothing abnormal. Temperature steady at 45 degrees, humidity at regulation levels, no unusual gases detected. Yet all 4 men could smell death so strongly it made their eyes water. Weber ordered them to check their gas masks, thinking maybe there'd been a leak in the filtration system. Every seal was perfect, every filter clean. The stench was there, real as their own sweat. But officially, scientifically, it didn't exist. Then came the voices, and this is where things got really unsettling. They were conducting their final equipment check before heading back to the surface when Braun suddenly went rigid, his young face draining of color. "Sir," he whispered, "do you hear that?" Weber listened, straining his ears against the constant hum of the generators, and there it was, conversation. Muffled, distant but unmistakably human voices speaking in what sounded like German. Multiple speakers, at least 6 or 7, engaged in what seemed like heated discussion. The sound appeared to originate from the sealed chambers on level 4, the ones marked with Kammler's seal, the ones they'd been explicitly ordered never to approach. Weber's first instinct was logical. Maybe there was a research team working late, Maybe the seals had been temporarily removed for some classified project, but when he radioed topside for confirmation, he got static, complete communications blackout. And here's the kicker. When they tried to trace the voices by moving closer to the sealed area, the conversation began to change. The German became older, more archaic, mixed with words none of them recognized, syllables that seemed to twist in their ears like physical things. Mueller, with his detective's instincts, timed the phenomenon. Exactly 37 minutes of voices, then silence. But when they checked the sealed doors the next morning in full daylight, dust patterns showed they hadn't been opened in months. Whatever they'd heard down there in the darkness, it wasn't coming from anyone who was supposed to be alive. Weber's first instinct was to rationalize everything. Hell, that's what kept soldiers sane in impossible situations. Maybe the scratching was thermal expansion in the concrete. Maybe old pipes settling behind the walls. The smell could have been a sewage backup, and voices? Well, sound played tricks in underground facilities, carrying conversations from God knows where through ventilation systems and structural gaps. But Mueller, with his detective background, wasn't buying any of it. Klaus, he said, using Weber's first name in that way that meant he was dead serious. I've investigated enough crime scenes to know the difference between explainable and impossible. What we experienced down there, that's not in any manual. So they did what good soldiers do. They investigated methodically. Zimmerman managed to restore partial radio contact with the surface, requesting any historical records about the area before Untold 7's construction. What came back in fragmented transmissions made Weber's blood run cold. The facility hadn't been built on empty mountain terrain like he'd been told. It had been constructed directly over the ruins of Schloss Rabenstein, a medieval castle that had been completely demolished by SS engineers in 1943. And here's the disturbing part. The demolition hadn't been for strategic reasons. According to classified Ahnenerbe records, the castle had been destroyed because of what they'd found in its foundations. The truth about Schloss Rabenstein came in pieces, fragments of information that painted a picture Weber wished he could unsee. The castle had belonged to Baron Friedrich von Rabenstein, a minor nobleman who'd lived there during the early 1600s, right in the heart of Europe's witch-hunting hysteria. But von Rabenstein hadn't been hunting witches. He'd been collecting them. Intelligence reports suggested the Baron had convinced local authorities that he was conducting scientific studies of heretical practices, which gave him legal access to accused witches before their executions. What he actually did with them in his castle's deep cellars was never fully documented, but local folklore spoke of screams that echoed through the mountains for weeks, of livestock found drained of blood of children who disappeared on nights when strange lights flickered from the castle windows. The SS had been fascinated by these stories, particularly Himmler's researchers, who believed they could harness whatever energies the Baron had been experimenting with. They'd spent months excavating the castle's foundations, uncovering chambers that defied architectural logic, rooms built in patterns that matched no known European design. And when they'd found what they were looking for, artifact symbols, and something the reports only referred to as biological samples, they'd built Untold 7 directly on top of the site, incorporating the original stone foundations into their concrete structure. 3 days after Weber's team first heard the voices, the second incident shattered any remaining illusions about their situation being normal. It happened during the day shift this time, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. Weber was reviewing supply inventories in the main office when every piece of electronic equipment in the facility simultaneously malfunctioned. Lights flickered in synchronized patterns, radio equipment screamed with feedback, and the ventilation system began cycling air so rapidly It created a howling wind through the corridors. Then, clear as a church bell, they heard singing. Not the archaic German voices from before, but something older. A melody that seemed to crawl directly into their brains, bypassing their ears entirely. The song was beautiful and horrible, like a lullaby sung by someone whose throat had been cut. Muller recognized it first. "Das ist kein Deutsch," he whispered. "That's not German. That's not human." The melody continued for exactly 13 minutes. Zimmerman timed it obsessively. And during those 13 minutes, every man in the facility reported the same vision. They saw shadows moving behind the walls, shapes that looked almost human but wrong in fundamental ways. And they all felt an overwhelming urge to walk toward the sealed chambers on level 4. When the singing stopped, they found scratch marks on the inside of the sealed doors, fresh gouges in steel that would have required industrial equipment to create. But here's what really broke their rational minds. The scratches spelled out words. Ancient words in a script that predated any known European language. Yet somehow, impossibly, they could all read them. The message was simple and chilling. "Wir hungern. Lasst uns heraus. We hunger. Let us out." On the 23rd night in hell, Weber made the worst decision of his military career, opening one of the sealed chambers. Look, you gotta understand, this wasn't curiosity or insubordination. By this point, none of them were sleeping. All of them were jumping at shadows. And the messages scratched into metal were appearing daily, each one more desperate, more hungry than the last. "Sie kommen näher." They're getting closer. "Das Fleisch ruft," the flesh calls. "Öffnet die Türen oder wir nehmen sie." Open the doors or we'll take them. Weber figured if they were going insane, at least they'd go insane with answers. Using Kammler's authorization codes they'd found in the facility records, Weber's team descended to level 4 at 0300 hours, their flashlights cutting through darkness that seemed almost solid. The sealed chamber they chose was smaller than the others, marked with symbols that looked like a combination of medieval German script and something far older. When the heavy steel door finally swung open, the smell that poured out nearly knocked them unconscious. Not the decay they'd grown accustomed to, but something alive and wrong, like infected wounds and sulfur. But what they saw inside that chamber, Christ, Weber would carry that image to his grave. The room was circular, carved from the original castle stone, with walls covered in what looked like astronomical charts, mixed with human anatomy diagrams. Except the anatomy was wrong, showing organs that didn't exist, and bone structures that defied medical knowledge. In the center stood an altar made from a single piece of black stone, its surface stained with substances that gleamed wet despite centuries of age. But that wasn't the worst part. Arranged around the altar in a perfect circle were 13 stone coffins, each carved with the same impossible script they'd been seeing throughout the facility. And every single coffin was empty, had been empty for a very long time, judging by the dust patterns. But here's what made Weber's rational mind finally snap. The coffins weren't just empty, they were broken open from the inside. Stone lids weighing hundreds of pounds had been shattered outward, leaving jagged edges that looked like teeth in some massive mouth. Fresh scratches covered the interior surfaces, and worse, there were what looked like bite marks in the stone itself, human-sized bite marks that had been gnawed deep enough to leave tooth impressions. As Weber's flashlight beam played across the scene, Muller grabbed his arm so hard it left bruises. "Klaus," he whispered, "look at the floor. Between the broken coffins and the altar, carved into the stone floor itself, were footprints." What happened next lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like hours of concentrated nightmare. The temperature in the chamber plummeted so suddenly that their breath became visible clouds, and every light source they carried Flashlights, emergency lanterns, even Zimmerman's radio display began to strobe in rapid, synchronized pulses. In those moments of flickering light and shadow, they saw them, figures moving just at the edge of vision, shapes that might once have been human but had been twisted by centuries of hunger into something else entirely. They were tall, impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that bent at wrong angles and faces that were mostly mouth. Wide, grinning mouths filled with teeth that looked like broken glass. Weber counted at least 7 of them, maybe more, circling just outside their light, making sounds that were part laughter, part sobbing, part the wet noise of eating. When Braun screamed, a sound that came from somewhere deeper than fear, the figures stopped moving and turned toward them in perfect unison. That's when Weber saw their eyes. Not empty sockets like he'd expected, but eyes that were completely black, like looking into deep water at night. And in those depths he could see faces. Human faces, twisted in permanent screams, pressing against the black surface as if trapped behind glass. These things hadn't just consumed bodies over the centuries. They'd consumed souls, and every person they devoured was still in there, still conscious, still screaming. The largest of the creatures took a step toward Weber's team, and when it spoke, its voice was a chorus of all those trapped souls speaking in unison. Endlich. Wir haben so lange gewartet, so lange gehungert. Finally. We have waited so long, hungered so long. What saved them wasn't courage or military training. It was pure animal instinct and one crucial realization that hit Weber like a physical blow. As the creatures began to move closer, their impossible mouths stretching wider in anticipation, he noticed something that his archaeological background had taught him to recognize. The symbols carved around the chamber weren't just decorative, they were containment runes, medieval binding circles designed to keep something trapped inside specific boundaries. The moment they'd opened that door, they'd broken a seal that had held for centuries, but the creatures weren't immediately attacking. They were testing the limits of their freedom like prisoners who'd been locked up so long they'd forgotten how to run. "Back to the door," Weber screamed, and his men moved with the coordinated efficiency of soldiers who'd survived impossible situations before. But here's the thing about facing supernatural horror. Your training only goes so far when reality starts bending around you. Moeller was closest to the exit when one of the creatures lunged, its elongated arms stretching across the chamber like rubber, claws raking deep gouges in the stone floor where his boots had been a split second before. Zimmerman managed to get his rifle up, firing 3 rounds center mass at the nearest thing. But the bullets passed through it like it was made of smoke, striking the chamber walls with sparks and ricochets. These weren't physical beings you could fight with conventional weapons. They were hunger-given form, centuries of starvation, and malevolence that had learned to wear human shapes like poorly fitted clothes. The only reason they escaped that chamber alive was speed and the creature's apparent unfamiliarity with their newfound freedom after so many centuries of imprisonment. The retreat through Anlage 7's corridors became a nightmare of pursuit that defied every law of physics Weber thought he understood. The creatures didn't run. They flowed, moving through solid concrete walls like water, appearing and disappearing in shadows that shouldn't have existed under the facility's bright fluorescent lights. Their voices followed Weber's team through every corridor, a constant chorus of whispered threats and promises. Ihr könnt nicht entkommen. Wir kennen jeden Gang, jede Tür. Wir waren hier schon vor euch. You cannot escape. We know every passage, every door. We were here before you. But strangest of all, the creatures seemed to be hurting them, forcing them toward the surface rather than simply overwhelming them in the underground maze. Weber realized with growing horror that these things weren't trying to kill them down in the depths. They wanted them to reach the outside world. Every time the team tried to take shelter in a sealed room or barricade a doorway, the creatures would simply wait, patient as death itself, until the soldiers were forced to keep moving upward. By the time they reached level 2, Braun was sobbing openly, muttering prayers and apologies in a voice that cracked with exhaustion and terror. Muller had gone completely silent, his detective's mind probably cataloging details that would haunt him for whatever remained of his life. And Zimmerman? Poor Zimmerman kept trying to radio for evacuation, broadcasting increasingly desperate mayday calls into static that seemed to laugh back at him. When they finally burst through the camouflaged entrance into the cold mountain air, gasping like drowning men who'd found the surface, Weber made the mistake of looking back at the bunker entrance one last time. The sight that met his eyes in that final glance confirmed his worst fears about what they'd unleashed upon the world. The creatures stood just inside the entrance, no longer the twisted, elongated horrors from the chamber, but wearing perfect human faces, the faces of Weber's own men. 3 figures that looked exactly like Muller, Zimmerman, and Braun smiled at him with expressions of infinite patience and hunger. But their eyes remained those bottomless black pools filled with screaming souls, and when they spoke in perfect unison, it was with voices Weber recognized from his own nightmares. Danke, Klaus. Danke, dass ihr uns befreit habt. Wir werden euch sehr bald folgen. Wir kennen eure Namen. Wir kennen eure Träume. Thank you, Klaus. Thank you for freeing us. We will follow you very soon. We know your names. We know your dreams. As Weber and his team stumbled away from Anlage 7, commandeering an abandoned Wehrmacht truck and driving through the night with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, he couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped at all. They'd simply been allowed to leave, messengers carrying word of something ancient and hungry back to a world that had forgotten how to fear the darkness between the stars. Behind them, the bunker entrance stood open like a mouth, and from its depths came the sound of something vast and patient beginning to move toward the surface, testing the boundaries of a freedom it had been denied for far too long. Records tell a sanitized version of what happened at Anlage 7. And like most official records, they're complete bullshit designed to protect people who don't deserve protection. According to Wehrmacht headquarters, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Weber's reconnaissance unit was reassigned due to structural instabilities in the research facility, which was subsequently sealed and abandoned as Allied forces advanced into the region. Clean, simple, bureaucratic. But here's what really happened in the weeks following their escape from hell. Weber filed a comprehensive report detailing everything they'd experienced, every impossible thing they'd witnessed, every supernatural horror that had nearly cost them their sanity. That report was classified immediately, then buried so deep that even the Ahnenerbe pretended it didn't exist. Weber himself was transferred to a punishment battalion on the Eastern Front, ostensibly for spreading defeatist propaganda and undermining morale through fantastic claims. Muller was committed to a military psychiatric facility after he refused to stop talking about creatures that wore human faces, and Zimmerman simply disappeared one night while on leave in Berlin, leaving behind only a note that read, "Sie haben mich gefunden. They found me." Only young Braun seemed to escape the systematic cover-up, but that's because he'd already lost his mind completely, spending his remaining months in a medical facility, drawing the same symbols over and over again on every available surface, muttering about hungry things that knew his dreams. 4 soldiers who'd served the fatherland faithfully were destroyed not by enemy bullets, but by their own command's refusal to acknowledge what they'd unleashed in those mountains. But the real horror, the part that should keep you awake at night, isn't what happened to Weber's team. It's what happened after Anlage 7 was officially sealed. See, bureaucratic cover-ups don't work on supernatural forces that have been hungry for centuries. Allied intelligence reports from the final weeks of the war mention strange incidents in villages surrounding the Harz Mountains. Entire families found dead in their homes with no signs of violence, their bodies perfectly preserved but somehow empty, like something essential had been drained out of them. Livestock discovered in fields, standing upright but completely motionless, their eyes reflecting light in ways that animal eyes shouldn't. And most disturbing of all, reports of German soldiers, Wehrmacht uniforms, proper insignia, military discipline, appearing in towns that had supposedly been evacuated months earlier, speaking to civilians in voices that sounded almost right, but carried undertones that made people's skin crawl. These soldiers asked questions about escape routes, about roads leading away from the mountains, about the fastest ways to reach populated areas. When American forces finally secured the region in April 1945, they found Unlager 7 exactly as Weber had left it. Entrance wide open, corridors echoing with sounds that recording equipment couldn't capture, and deep in level 413, empty stone coffins that radiated cold, even in the spring warmth. The Americans sealed the bunker with concrete and steel, then posted guards who reported nothing unusual except for the dreams. Vivid, shared nightmares about being watched by things that knew their names and spoke in the voices of people they'd lost. Within 6 months, the entire guard detail had requested transfers, and by 1946, the site was abandoned entirely, left to nature, and whatever was patient enough to wait beneath tons of concrete and earth. Because here's the truth about evil, real evil. It doesn't die when wars end, it doesn't fade when empires fall, and it sure as hell doesn't stay buried just because scared men with shovels pile dirt on top of it. Some hungers are older than nations, and some darkness is patient enough to outlast the civilizations that try to contain it. You know what really gets me about this whole story? It's not the supernatural horror or even the body count. It's the arrogance. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of men who thought they could harness forces they didn't understand, control powers that existed before human beings learned to make fire. The Ahnenerbe, Himmler, all those SS researchers who played with symbols and artifacts like they were children's toys. They never asked themselves the important question, what if we're wrong? What if the things our ancestors locked away weren't locked away because they were valuable, but because they were too dangerous to exist in the same world as human beings? Weber and his men paid the price for that arrogance, but they weren't the only ones. Every person who vanished in those final weeks of the war, every family found dead in their homes, every soldier who reported seeing things that couldn't exist, they all paid for decisions made by men in comfortable offices who never had to face the consequences of their ambitions. And somewhere in sealed records that will never see daylight, there are other reports. Other bunkers, other experiments, other teams of soldiers who found things that should have stayed lost. The war ended in 1945, but for some people, the ones who opened doors that should have remained sealed, the real war is still going on. It's a war fought in nightmares and whispered warnings, in dreams that feel too real and shadows that move when no one's watching. So the next time someone tells you that the past is dead and buried, remember Klaus Weber and his team. Remember that some things don't stay buried, and some hungers never die. They just wait, patient as death itself, for someone foolish enough to give them what they've been craving all along. A way back into a world full of fresh meat and screaming souls. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the darkest corners of history. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any episodes. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel, because believe me, we have many more stories about the things that go bump in the night and the soldiers or fools foolish enough to face them. Stay vigilant, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying battles are the ones that never made it into the history books.